Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Royal Irish Academy and distinguished guests, I'd like to begin by welcoming you to this very topical and timely webinar hosted by the Royal Irish Academy and ALLEA to discuss the important issue of climate change education. The Royal Irish Academy is proud to be a member of ALLEA, the European Federation of Academies in Science and Humanities. The ALLEA Science Education Working Group is just one of several ALLEA projects that Academy members and Irish experts are currently contributing to and leading on. Academy-nominated Irish-based experts have made significant contributions to European policy projects on issues including research integrity and ethics, health inequalities, and trust in scientific expertise, to name a few. Today's event focuses on ALLEA's recent report on climate change education initiatives in Europe. We're delighted to be represented on the ALLEA group behind this project by an excellent scholar in Dr. Cleona Murphy. Dr. Murphy has been a member of ALLEA's Science Education Working Group since 2015. In January 2019, she was nominated to chair a subgroup of this working group to carry out the European survey on climate change education initiatives. She then became chair of ALLEA's Science Education Working Group. In June 2019, Dr. Murphy has been an excellent ambassador for the Academy, and we are very grateful for her time, efforts, and expertise. We're also honored to be joined here this afternoon by such eminent guests and speakers. We have a very diverse audience, with people joining us from government and academic departments, NGOs, the media, and the general public. As Senior Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy, I would like to express a warm welcome, in particular, to our international speakers joining us from Belgium, France, and Poland. I look forward to hearing from you all shortly. But first, I will hand over to today's chair, Dr. Ben Mallon. Ben is Assistant Professor in Geography and Citizenship Education in the School of STEM Education, Innovation and Global Studies in the Institute of Education, Dublin City University. Working within initial teacher education, Dr. Mallon's teaching supports student teachers to develop their classroom practices in response to the significant global sustainability issues with which we are faced. He has recently published works on European teacher education and global citizenship, inquiry-based science education and sustainability, and young people's climate action in the Irish context. He also sits on the editorial board of Policy and Practice, a development education review. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over to Dr. Mallon.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here today for what promises to be an interesting and important event. So today's session will begin with 4 presentations which set the background context to climate change education and the ALLEA report. Presentations which share the substance of the report, a snapshot of climate change education initiatives in Europe, and considers responses to the report. We'll then move to a panel discussion that will provide an opportunity, hopefully, for some reflection on the content of these presentations and an opportunity to consider some of the wider implications. Throughout, there'll be an opportunity for you to pose your own questions to the panel using the chat forum, and hopefully we'll have a time to address some of these during our closing discussions. So I'd like to begin by welcoming Professor Pavel Ravinsky as our first speaker. Professor Ravinsky is Vice President of the Polish Academy of Sciences and an ALLEA board member. His research interests include mathematical methods in geophysics, geophysical flows, climate change, river hydrodynamics, and he has published more than 170 refereed scientific publications. He serves as an associate editor for several prominent scientific research journals, and in 2018 he was elected to the Vice Chair of the European Division Leadership Team of the International Association for Hydro Environment, Engineering and Research. Welcome, Professor Ravinsky.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen first. Thank you for these very kind words. I feel extremely privileged that I can speak on behalf of ALLEA. And let me firstly thank the Royal Irish Academy for organizing this extremely important event. I have to say that you already mentioned that I am a geophysicist myself, so you can imagine that climate change issues are extremely important for me, and they cannot be put on hold just because of pandemia. So I am very happy that we have this today discussion. My role today is just to say a few words what ALLEA in fact is, and just to say it shortly, it is the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities, which represents, sorry, it doesn't work, yes, which represents more than 50 academies from nearly 40 European countries and also non-European European Union countries. It was established in 1994, so you can see that's a quite young organization, but young also means very strong organization as well. And this is an organization that speaks out on behalf of its members, member academies, and it mostly promotes science as a global public good. It also helps facilitate scientific collaboration across borders and disciplines. And just recently, the board established 7 strategic objectives of these organizations. I will very shortly go through them. So, first of all, we want our member academies to benefit from our activities, I mean ALLEA's activities, to facilitate inter-academic exchange and also to harmonize cooperation among European academic networks. By shaping the conditions for research, we understand a number of issues, but among them it's the promotion of excellence, multidisciplinarity, mobility, also international cooperation. We also try to offer pathways for our member academies to provide independent and interdisciplinary scientific advice to policymakers. And you might have heard about kind of a key project, European projects, which is SAPEA, which is the European Commission Scientific Advice Mechanism. Next is facilitating good research practice. So more or less it's to provide guidance on how to prevent, for example, research misconduct, and also to enable researchers to follow best practice. It is particularly through the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. Also, what is very important, we want to provide assistance and also to advise our academies in difficult circumstances. You can remember, for example, the last difficult situation in Hungary, and this is the moment when ALLEA can have a strong voice. There is also an important part to establish collaboration, for example, with other organizations from other sectors on topics of mutual interest, but also, for example, to establish collaboration with early career researchers. And last but not least, we want to promote science as a global and public good without any borders, and we simply want to represent the Academy's interests in Europe, but also beyond Europe. So we try to do it on the scale of the whole world. I am not going to mention all the rich activities of ALLEA. You can just have a look at the slide and to see, for example, where ALLEA speaks up, for example, about where the science advice of ALLEA is playing a major role. It's, for example, in genome editing for crop improvement, data governance, health inequalities, migration of health, or international transfer of health data. And what I also would like to mention, there are various formats of how the ALLEA works. And you can see that we work through our working groups. Some of them are permanent working groups. And Science Education Working Group that is our host for our meeting today is one of those frameworks of our work. There are also task forces, projects of various kinds. Some of them are EU funded, like SAPEA and Pericia. There is, of course, plenty to say about ALLEA, but let me finish at this stage and let me wish you a very fruitful and I hope very fruitful discussion. I hope we will have a really stimulating debate about climate change, in particular climate change education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ravinsky. I would now like to welcome Professor Pierre Lénard, who is Emeritus Professor at the Université Paris Diderot. And Professor Lénard will be talking about the importance and the role of climate change education. Professor Lénard is a French astrophysicist. His scientific work focused on infrared astronomy and star formation. And in this work, his interest in image quality led him to towards original work in relation to image quality for astronomy and a contribution towards the development of adaptive optics and the development of a European Very Large Telescope in Chile. Amongst other significant work, in 2018, Professor Lénard has, in order to support the education aspects of the Paris Agreement and the IPCC actions, he developed the Office for Climate Education in connection with the Inter-Academy Partnership and prepared the designation of the Office for Climate Education as a UNESCO Category 2 Centre, achieved at the end of 2019. So welcome, Professor Lénard.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation of the Irish Academy to this seminar. I will try to get the screen. See, screen sharing. Didn't put the right screen. Here it is. Somehow. Are you seeing my PowerPoint? Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, it's there now.
Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yeah, yes, the PowerPoint's there. The PowerPoint is there.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I can start. I'm going to speak on the importance and the role of climate change education. And of course, many of the remarks I'm going to do are in a very particular context, the COVID-19. And I think we can draw some lessons from the current state of the pandemics for our next purpose on climate education. First, who would have accepted the idea in December, just a year ago, that a year after the pandemic, which was just beginning in a little town in China, would put all the world economy upside down and provoke a 10% increase on mortality on so many countries, over 150 countries. This interdependence was not in people's mind a year ago. It was unfamiliar, it was unbelievable, but it was there. And of course, this is essential for climate. We have also observed this year a new situation for science in the general public and the politicians, but also the general public. Usually, science in the process of making is done in laboratories, in reviews, in conferences, not in front of the public. What the public knows is the science well established, what is taught in school, in universities, which is presented in newspapers, not science in the process of making. And of course, this new situation led to many misunderstandings. And this is not exactly so true for climate science, but there is part of that, of course, because it has to do with uncertainties. Then it questioned the legitimacy of scientists' public expression. Who is legitimate to speak? Academies, individuals, with journalists on media? Who can one trust? So it came to a big matter of trust in many countries, including very developed ones. And then we have observed a conflict of values, freedom versus rationality, solidarity versus selfish, in a sense, self-salvation, delegation, questionable delegation to democratic decision process versus direct expression of people, despair versus hope. This conflict is perceptible almost every day. Now, somehow, rationality versus emotions when facing complexity. And indeed, as climate, the COVID issue is a complex issue, and the virus is not yet properly understood, neither the climate. The question of acceptability of technological solutions. This is in front of us with vaccines. And we can question, at least in some countries, how it will be accepted by the people. Now, my point on this very quick summary is that it's easy to argue, and I think to prove, that education all the way can help dealing with all these points. I would not say for the next pandemic, but certainly for climate education. Now, I take just a quick example on another parameter where education has helped, life expectancy through hygiene. Here is a curve of the life expectancy at birth in France since 18th century. And you can see the points where science or refusal of science, it was the case for Semmelweis in Vienna by mid-1850, has slowly came in the picture. But science is not entirely responsible, as we observed in the last 7 years. Hygiene, which really came in education systems after World War I, for reasons understandable, has changed the pattern, and we see the result. Of course, there are other factors there, but it's clear that education has played its role. And so what we want to achieve for climate is something similar, but much quicker. And that's where the difficulty lies, in the rapidity of the change. Now, to be a little optimistic, in the last 2 or 3 decades, we have observed a slow IPCC, and then year after year, or 5 years after 5 years, for the assessment report, the continuous status report of the science and the potential consequences versus various scenarios. The educational frame came up rather early, but very slowly. And it's only after the COP 2018, I believe, that the Doha program was really endorsed by and began in its action. And today, this action is still very limited. Then came the Paris Agreement with this Article 12, which the unanimity of approval of the Paris Agreement made a quasi-obligation for signatory parties to implement climate education. And of course, for our work, it's an essential moment there. Then UNESCO analyzed the next year the context in many countries, and of course the context has not yet progressed much. Then came the movement of the youth, the climate marches, the school strikes, the role of Greta Thunberg, and so on, which made clear that the youth was mobilized with emotion more than with deep rationality, but the youth was present and was asking something, of course, to the society, but to the education system. The scholars have not been absent. There is an abundant literature. In fact, I was surprised when I glanced through it since 2000, but this is mostly conceptual. How should the education be for climate? Should it be at which field, which interdisciplinary character? How can one evaluate it? You can imagine all the questions, interesting ones, but conceptual, having no grasp direct on what happens in schools. Then slowly in the last 2 years or so, curricula and policies began to change. There is clearly an emergence around real in schools. And then we have now the EU Green Plan and the hope that in the call for the Green Plan, there is a section, a significant funding for education changes. So this is the progress. Of course, the key of the progress is in the teachers' preparation, the help we can bring to them to empower them to deal with these complicated issues of climate. Of course, in my time, we have written already many things on that. I cannot address why is it complicated, but everybody can feel that a completely interdisciplinary with social interaction, hard and social science is complex to integrate in curricula which are not built this way. They are built on subjects. Nevertheless, there are a number worldwide of interesting and recent initiatives. The public support for climate change education at this stage, if I'm not mistaken, I would say it's minimal. There is a battle that has to win. Now, I would like to address in a few minutes a question which I consider difficult for educators. What is the place of climate education with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were proclaimed in 2015, which are now well established for the UN Agenda 2030, which are being quoted, discussed everywhere, including ministries of education? If we look at the objective, it's summarized in 3 short sentences: eradicate poverty, protect the planet, guarantee prosperity for all. Fine, excellent. But can you quote one single human activity which does not fit in either of those 3 categories or in the 3 of them? So transforming this in concept has already been done, and this gives 17 SDGs, 169 sub-themes, and climate is there, and education is there too. But how can one insert this into curricula? There are risks everywhere. One can weaken rigorous science pedagogy for a kind of very vague discourse on development, which has to mix all the issues, like shown in the sub-themes, and accounting for a very broad interdisciplinarity, the difficulty of subjects in schools, and multifactorial issues. And we know issues in science are difficult to convey and to be understood, especially by young students. And then there is an additional difficulty to teach that in school. It's how can one properly separate between the science facts, which are facts, the ethical choices, which are values. I wouldn't say opinion, but they are choices, but they are values. They are not on the same footage as science facts. And finally, the political militantism, which is very legitimate, but which may not be proper in schools. So putting all that into curricula, and we have done the exercise in French for the 12th grade, I've participated to this, it's difficult. There is a risk with the SDGs of a pure incantation because of the difficulties. And the point I would like to make here is that climate change education is much simpler because it's complex, but it has deep science roots. It's rather limited. It's connected to all the other themes, or most of them, no question of that. But if it's done per se, it's probably more clear for teachers and more efficient for students than to make it one of the many sustainable development topics. This is an open question. I do not pretend to solve the problem in this short presentation. I just raise it because I see it almost every day in the French system and in other places. Now, I would like to conclude my presentation with some proposition which seems the directions for future work. I think that this clarification, which has been actually addressed in some of the scholarly work I have mentioned before, there would be a handbook for science, for climate adaptation and attenuation, which is in press now, which will probably help. Springer is the publisher, which will probably help to make a point. Now, I think we have to pursue in parallel two goals. One is the evolution of curricula, but that's difficult because of the inertia of the system, because of the many factors to account for, because of the democratic process, which choice of a curriculum and so on. But there is urgency. So the action within existing of action to manage it. I quote at the bottom of the slide, an interesting work done in India with ICSU, now it's the International Council for Science, merging of science unions with social sciences and humanities union. And this is exactly the purpose of the analysis and web resources they give. Unfortunately, at the moment, they only give that for, say, high school, the end of high school, and the first junior years in university. But this is along this track. What can we do without changing anything to the curriculum? But we have to include two factors for both curricula and action. The first one is to mobilize the scientific community because the climate science is complex, the science is complex in general. We have to there is an IPCC national focal point. It can be in the Ministry of Environment or in or energy, but in most of the cases, I think over 150 cases, it's in the Ministry of Environment. This is the connecting point with IPCC. And it has all the information on the progress of reports and the action in the given country. And so it's the point around which, it's a person, of course, the mobilization could happen, including, of course, universities and research centers. The second point is to keep the focus on inquiry pedagogy. If there is something where the youth needs to be made active, it's climate. And it's a special type of activity because it has to connect the local to the global. Many schools are having nice gardens or take care of the plastics in the school or to turn the faucet off or the electricity off. This is fine, but in the student's mind, is that properly related to the issues of the carbon budget, of the ocean acidification and so on? And that's a real difficulty which can only be addressed with inquiry pedagogy, making students active. Of course, the heart of that is helping teachers. How can one help them? First, trusting them. Trusting them to be able to implement in the existing curriculum some aspects of climate education. But to do that, they require adequate training, collective work, network exchanges, and of course, pedagogical resources. This is why we have created this Office for Climate Education, working worldwide for both developed and developing countries, with a focus on developing ones, because the poor are certainly the ones who are suffering most from climate and will in the future. And the office is now having a strong connection with UNESCO, and that will help us. And finally, a point which is not so clear when we try to implement a new curriculum or new ideas in existing one. It's the active participation of the students. Of course, inquiry has this in principle, and this is fine. But in this particular case, given the mobilization of the youth with a lot of emotion and wish to change their future, which is threatened by the climate change, then they have to be made real participants of this. And then there is the issue of funding, and this is the conclusion I come to, because we can hope that there would be an ambitious EU program, which is not necessarily very expensive, to ensure production of resources, training, network exchanges. This is so important. Public advertisement of the action, consultation of Minister of Education for the evolution of curricula. Some countries are moving ahead. Italy is moving ahead. Germany, the lenders, some lenders are moving ahead. France is doing a little bit too. Ireland is doing a lot, I know. So this collective action, despite subsidiarity, which is not so important in our case, could help. And of course, international cooperation like in IAP or in EISC, as I mentioned before. Those are some directions which we could explore. And I finish with a wish, which I presented at the last COP in Madrid. In 2007, we had a report, the Rocard report. Rocard was European Parliament, and he had been Prime Minister of France. And he published a report on science education to renew pedagogy in Europe. There was a significant amount of money decided by the Commission, And then for 10 years, we observed the wealth of pedagogical initiatives around inquiry, this renewed pedagogy, in all the countries of the Union. So what do we need now? We need that. We have the challenge. The science community is present. In UK, the Met Office, in France with Pierre-Simon Laplace, in Germany with the Potsdam Institute and so many others. We need engaged teachers for the future of Europe. This is what I hope will happen within the Green program or beyond that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Léonard, for that really interesting presentation. I'm sure it seemed to generate a number of questions, which hopefully we'll be able to return to. I would now like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Cliona Murphy. Dr. Cliona Murphy is Associate Professor in Dublin City University and is the ALLEA Science Education Working Group Chair. Dr. Murphy has been lecturing in the area of science education at tertiary level for 20 years, has conducted and published research and developed educational resources in the areas of nature of science, inquiry-based science education, education for sustainability, and climate change education. Welcome, Cliona.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you here. And of course, you see the very end of it. So today, what I'm going to do is, I don't have a lot of time today. So what I'm going to do is present some of the findings from this ALLEA report that was published in May. Now, the report is called A Snapshot of Climate Change Education Initiatives in Europe. And in case I forget to tell you, the full report is available to download from the ALLEA website. So just initially to give you a little bit of context to the report, the ALLEA Science Education Working Group realizes and really understands the significant role climate change education has to play in making sure that our young people have the requisite knowledge and skills to understand and to mitigate against climate change education, or against climate change. And as all of you are more than likely aware, there are a number of educational resources and initiatives throughout Europe that are supporting climate change education. And these vary from education resources for teachers, for students, there's a certain amount of professional development for teachers, and there's numerous conferences and gatherings that afford those interested in climate change education to come together to discuss various methods for teaching about climate change. But what the working group realized was there was actually a dearth of documentation providing a general overview of all of these initiatives. So we thought it would be a good idea to carry out a small scoping survey and basically to see, could we map an overview of these current initiatives in climate change education throughout Europe. Now, it was a small scoping review, but I suppose the aim of our review was to get an insight into the overall aims of these initiatives, maybe looking at their target audiences, what kind of supports were available for teachers for teaching about climate change. And then to get an idea of the type of organizations that were that were delivering or had these initiatives, from government organizations to NGOs to higher education institutes, etc. And then to get an idea of whether these initiatives were focused on local, national or regional level. So to do this, we developed an online survey that was piloted in 4 countries: Denmark, France, Ireland and Sweden. And then the ALLEA administered the survey to all their 58 academies, and the academies were asked to circulate the survey to those that they believed were interested or had a vested interest in climate change education. So we got 67 responses from 14 countries. Now, descriptive analysis were used to analyze the responses from the surveys. So we tried to identify patterns and averages excuse me, in the types of initiatives, their scope, their content, age groups, etc. And in addition to this, the content analysis was used to explore themes that emerged in the open responses, again related to the overall aims and the descriptions of the initiatives. Now, I'm saying this it was a small sample, it was a scoping survey, and we're not drawing generalizations from this survey by any means, but it does provide a summary, a snapshot of some of these initiatives. And the findings are informative and they're particularly timely, I suppose, especially in the light of the Green Deal call under the H2020 proposal, or framework, sorry. So this is just a little glance at the 67 responses to 14 countries. So we can see there on that table there the countries who participated in the survey, the number of responses from each survey, or from each country rather, and then across the top you can see the type of organization that actually responded to the survey. So I'll let you leave that there for a second. And you can see there that there was a mixture of government organizations, NGOs, the academies themselves, higher education institutions as well. So in looking at the responses in the 67 responses, so in relation to the scope of these initiatives, more than half of the initiatives self-identified as being national in terms of their scope. And many of them were considered having multi-level scope. So what do I mean by multi-level scope? That's looking at its local, at a local level, but also then at either regional or national level. So to give you an example of one of the initiatives in Norway, the Science Education for Action and Engagement towards Sustainability, this works at a community level, developing models and tools and resources that contribute to community well-being, but at the same time also creating regional and national networks that support engagement for science and action. Many of you here in Ireland will be very familiar with the Young Environmentalist Award, and the aim of that is to empower young people to take action at a local level to protect the environment and to raise awareness among their communities. But at the same time, the different projects are disseminated at a national and a regional level. So looking, as I said, I'm not presenting all the findings, but I thought this might be interesting for today, to looking at the target age of these initiatives, and very high percentages, nearly 75% of the initiatives were focused at primary level. So you can see here 16 at lower primary and 33 of the 67 at upper primary. We can also see there was a secondary school, 35 of the 67 looked at or focused at a secondary school students. And then just looking at the table there, looking in terms of the higher education institutes that responded, there was more or less equal distribution between undergraduate modules being offered at undergraduate level and modules to support the teaching at postgraduate level. So in terms of the education supports that the initiatives provided, perhaps not surprisingly, very high numbers offering education resources for students and for teachers. So looking at 55 and 54 of the 67 initiatives respectively. And then looking here at 35 of the initiatives said they had websites in relation to show their resources, etc., for climate change education. Now, one thing, and this is something that Professor Lena actually mentioned in his presentation, was looking in terms of the professional development for teachers or teacher training. Only 17 of them actually provided support, educational support in terms of professional development for teaching, which kind of raised eyebrows here. So we looked into a little more and we looked at the type of professional development that these initiatives were providing, the mode of delivery as such. And we looked here and we see 48% of the initiatives were face-to-face and 40% are blended, a mixture of face-to-face online. Now, I suppose the reason I chose to present these findings was in relation to the recommendations in terms of the importance of teacher education and professional development to provide for teachers, but also now, particularly in line of, you know, the pandemic this year, the mode of delivery for professional development. Have we consider, you know, innovative modes through MOOCs, etc. But I will talk to you about this in terms of recommendations and perhaps in terms of implications for Ireland. And a final finding now, there were other findings, but I just chose to look at this one, that a lot of the vast majority of the initiatives focus on the causes of climate change, and fewer of them focus on mitigation and adaptation. And again, this is something I will discuss about you in the recommendations of the need to focus more on mitigation and adaptation. And 25 of them looking at climate change technologies, and 10 making the links, or explicitly making the links between climate change and sustainability and the SDGs. Okay, so we had 7 broad recommendations from this report, or from the findings. And the first was that, it is only a scoping survey. It's a snapshot of the initiatives. So a wider, more large scale survey or research has to be done to collate exemplars of good climate change education resources for all different age groups. And basically, these need to be collated and they're quality assessed. In order to do so, then obviously a set of criteria or a framework needs to be developed so to facilitate this work. As I said just a minute or two, the initiatives need to focus more on mitigation and adaptation. Yes, it is important to talk about climate change and the causes, but we need it is essential that the future initiatives have a bigger focus on mitigation and adaptation. And the working group is recommending that for the development of future climate change and education initiatives, that the IPCC reports should be frequently consulted, because these provide the most up-to-date developments in climate science, but also outline potential solutions for mitigation and adaptation. In recommendation 3, and the question arose, for example, in the context of mitigation. So when it is being addressed in different initiatives in developed countries, to what extent are students being supported in their understanding about the role society today has to play in acting not only in their own interests, but in the interests of others? And another point that we felt was really important to make was that students have got to understand that mitigation is not only crucial for future generations, but is also essential for current disadvantaged populations on whom climate change is having the biggest impact, resulting in these populations having to deal with significant bigger challenges. So we're looking that we need more information on the extent climate justice is being addressed in different educational proposals or initiatives. So, and there's a lot of research in here, and when children are learning about climate change, it can provoke a sense of helplessness among our children and young people. So we really recommend that future initiatives really need to focus on solutions and collective actions, to foster a sense of agency in our young students, so to decrease their potential eco-anxiety. In looking at recommendation 5, we noticed that there was quite a gap in the age range that the different initiatives targeted, and there was particularly very few initiatives that were focused on early years education. So we recommended that there was a need there for climate education resources to be developed for early years education. Now, we're not suggesting that we go into the whole detail on climate change, and the science behind it, but perhaps focus for the early years on more concrete topics, for example, like waste, biodiversity, the fair usage of materials. And then in terms of climate change, that these programs might focus maybe starting on, the differences between climate and weather, etc. Now, really, we did notice that there isn't enough provision for it. It wouldn't appear that there's a lot of initiatives that focus on professional development for teachers. So we really recommended that significant research is needed to research into what effective climate change and professional development would look like, and then so there needs to be work on the development and the implementation of high quality professional development for teachers. Now, that's not enough further research then, once these professional development has been rolled out, there is a need to research the impact of teachers' participation in professional development on their confidence and their competence in teaching about climate change, but more importantly on students and young people's learning. So to do that again, and we very much, the members of the working group are very pleased to see that in the Green Deal call that there is look for a European competency framework. And indeed that one of the recommendations from our report was that, that a framework or a set of criteria needs to be developed for effective professional development. And again, as Professor Lena was saying, the working group who Professor Lena was a member of, suggests strongly that effective pedagogies for the effective teaching of climate change education, or climate change rather, is inquiry-based pedagogies, is nature of science pedagogies, particularly if you're looking now in science in the process, not looking at nature science pedagogies will be important there, and project-based pedagogies. And again, as Professor Lena was also saying in his presentation, there's important to look to see how the initiatives map and link with national curriculum, and how curriculum can inform climate change education. Now, that's, and I know it's rather rushed, there's full details of the report on the ALLEA website. But now, if I may, with my with a slightly different hat, but looking at the implications of the report for Ireland. And as many of you know from Ireland and who are involved in climate change education, there are numerous initiatives in Ireland that are currently going on to support climate change education. There's numerous different providers, from NGOs, from national organisations for higher education institutions, from outreach centres, and lots of resources there in terms of teaching, education resources for teachers, education resources for students as well. There are some professional development modules that teachers can take, and they vary in length and type. And there are, within initial teacher education, where we prepare our future teachers, there are compulsory and elective modules provided for our student teachers with regard to climate education, climate change education. So, but you know, we haven't got really an overarching picture of the overall aims, contents, and approaches in these initiatives. So there is a need to collate all of these together. But I suppose the ultimate aim of our job as educators in Ireland is to ensure that our young people, that Irish young people, understand the issues around climate change, that they have sound scientific conceptual knowledge about climate change, and that in school they are afforded frequent opportunities to apply and develop scientific skills, critical thinking and problem thinking skills, which are all essential to understand and to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So that's all pie in the sky. So where might we start? What needs to be done? No more than that ALLEA working group suggested for Europe. In terms of Ireland, we need to look at these resources, and we need to collate the resources and assess them for good quality. The Irish educators, or people involved in climate change education, need to work together to discuss what a framework for effective climate change education, what should it look like? What aspects, what competencies should the resources promote? In this assessment, or in this collation, we need to identify gaps that are there, and then if necessary, develop future additional resources that will be in line with the framework. We've got to look at our primary and post-primary curriculum, and we've got to see and ensure that the education resources on climate change are linked with the primary and post-primary curriculum, but also that there is explicit reference to climate change education and education for sustainability in our curriculum documentation. And then once all this job is done, very simple, we need to put all of these resources in one centralized location so that they're easily accessible for teachers. Professional development, our teachers are absolutely vital. We have 100% need their backing, and they need to be supported so that they feel confident and competent and want to teach about climate change education. They need to be supported. So it's up to us to look at the current provision of professional development for teachers, to look at it, assess it, and identify high quality modules. identify gaps in professional development providing, and then develop innovative models of professional development that will support teachers in engaging in these effective pedagogies. And quite often in Ireland and the history, we have this approach to professional development that the one size fits all. You know, we have an education resource, we have a curriculum, we do a certain amount of activities or lesson plans with teachers and say, off you go. You know, that's not the type of professional development our Irish teachers need. They need competencies, they need to develop pedagogies so that they themselves feel confident and have the skills to implement any climate change education curriculum. And then we need to look at our initial teacher education modules. We need to support our student teachers. So as they leave and start becoming newly qualified teachers, that they have some understanding of climate change education. Lastly, what needs to be done, and I hope I'm preaching to the converted here today, that we need to establish a national steering committee that will oversee all of this work, that will look at assessment of resources and professional development modules, that would look at developing frameworks, etc. And this national steering committee should have representatives from all those with a vested interest in climate change education. So looking at government organisations, representatives from non-government organisations, representatives from higher education, universities, etc., from the academies. So we need a wealth of expertise to put on a steering committee to oversee this work. And I end with the same sentiment as Professor Lena said. We're going to need funding to this, because without funding, I don't believe that this will happen. So I think that's my tuppence worth for now. Did I go over the 15 minutes? Of course I did.
Thanks very much, Cliona, for giving a really sort of insightful overview of a report which raises a number of really important questions. I think it's been shared in the chat there, so people can explore it in more depth.
Great.
So I would like now to welcome Dr. Philippe Toukens, who is acting head of the Climate and Planetary Boundaries Unit in the Directorate Healthy Planet of the European Commission. So Dr. Toukens is going to provide the European Commission's response to the ALLEA report. Since 2019, Dr. Toukens has been Deputy Head of the Unit Climate and Planetary Boundaries in the Research and Innovation Directorate General of the European Commission. The unit he works for manages the programming of EU research and innovation activities and contributes to relevant research and innovation policies in the areas of climate, biodiversity, natural disaster risk management and environmental observation. During recent years, he's worked on accelerating clean energy innovation in the context of the Energy Union and as a policy assistant to the Deputy Directorate General of DG Research and Innovation. So welcome, Dr. Toukens.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yes?
Yes, fine, yes.
You see my slide, the full slide? Okay, thank you. I'll try to be short because it must be exhausting for the people to watch presentations one after another. But it's a real pleasure to see that so much is happening in this field. The question for this session is, can climate change education save the planet? I could give a very short answer saying, well, as mathematicians would say, it's a necessary condition, but not sufficient. It's clear everybody understands that we need to bring our lifestyles back within the planetary boundaries and respond through concrete action. For that, we need effective policies and the active role of all EU citizens to address climate change and halt human harmful activities on the environment. Everybody has understood that. And therefore, climate education is essential to transfer the competence and fighting climate change. I won't repeat what has been said very well by the previous speakers, but I would say that my view is that currently the deficit is still quite large on both education and skills development. We heard before that there are a number of initiatives, material available and so on, but I wonder why the education on climate change didn't penetrate enough. I happen to be in a family with 5 kids, and most of them, although they are fully aware because of their father about climate education, but they have not heard much about climate science in their classes of physics, chemistry, biology. They heard more about climate change in other classes on religion or ethics or classes of English, where they had to discuss topics. I think this is an important fact. Of course, maybe this differs very much across Europe. I'm sure that some member states have introduced climate science in their programs, but in my view, as long as we don't introduce it officially in the programs, we will still remain with a deficit, and the kids happen to learn on climate change mostly outside the schools than at the school. I would like to also say through this that education is not only for young people, but for all generations. We heard that. Actually, my generation, I'm 52, I did my PhD on climate modeling. At that time, I was told, why do we use public money to fund such activities? It's clear that humans have no influence on the climate. It's a question of scale. Things have changed, fortunately, but I feel in my generation that we have huge responsibility. People from my generation are also amongst the leaders, the policy leaders, and they are the first who need to be educated and not turn to the kids saying it's for your generation to solve the problem and to clean the mess that previous generation left to you. This is of course a bit rough language, but this is what I hear from my kids and from others I'm often in touch with, because I'm involved also in following in the school climate neutrality programming in the school of the kids. And so I get the opportunity to have direct feedback from what the youth says about what the previous generation have done for this issue. So all we have a responsibility, and we all need to be further educated and not contribute to the climate skepticism that delayed climate action very much over the last decades. Also, I must say, I think that now we are beyond education. We need to practice. We are not asking teachers or scholars or students to become activists, no, but scientists need to go beyond their traditional role of transferring knowledge, and they need to participate to testing solutions. The clock is ticking, and there's a climate objective for the EU. I'll come to that in a minute. And I'm in touch with, of course, many researchers funded by EU research projects, and we see the young generation of researchers increasingly aware and conscious that they need to go beyond the traditional role of researchers, which is publishing and teaching, of course, and they are engaged in transition labs, experiments on the ground to find and develop solutions, and this will fuel also research with a lot of interesting results. So what is the EU doing in this context? Well, we have the ongoing Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program that demonstrates a strong commitment to research targets of the Paris Agreement. We have on the policy side the EU long-term strategy for 2050, climate neutrality by 2050, which is quite ambitious because we have only 30 years to get there. And recently, I suppose you have heard that the EU proposed to increase the target to go further in the reduction from 1990 emissions level and reach 55% of greenhouse gas reduction from 1990 level by 2030. So this is within a decade. It's a massive effort that will require a whole revision of all the relevant legislation, but technology, legislation will not suffice. It will require change of behavior and massive, I would say, acceleration of the pace of change that European society can implement. We have, of course, in the Green Deal communication, given the policy line, and on the Green Deal communication, I wish to stress that the goal is not to address climate change only, but also the other relevant dimension touching on other planetary boundaries, such as biodiversity, no pollution, and other initiatives that are fully relevant and that are equally important. For instance, the challenge on biodiversity is immense. It's a very complex issue, and we need to address climate policy along with biodiversity policies through the implementation of systemic solutions. Of course, in this context, research, innovation, and education will play a pivotal role to reach the EU climate goals. So we heard in the first presentation reference to the Green Deal call. So the last call of Horizon 2020, you will easily find it on Google, gives you a great opportunity to make proposals that will be funded by the EU and compete to that to develop the activities that have been presented. It's true that the EU is proposing. I heard the call for funding. It's nice that people turn to the EU for funding, but I should say here, to be fully transparent, that it's not easy for the EU to propose activities on education. The subsidiarity issue is raised by the member states, and when the European Commission proposes to develop contents or even suggests that programs in schools, in universities, and in high schools could be adapted, the reaction of the member states is immediate. They recall the principle of subsidiarity as a major principle. So it's interesting to see that for funding activities, the EU is welcome to intervene further in the update of the program. It is more difficult, and I think all citizens of the EU should know this. In this context, this goal is a good opportunity to create EU multidisciplinary competence framework for climate change education. Also to develop citizen science and observation. Please have a look at the content of the call in detail and apply if you think that you can be part of a good consortium to compete. We'll be very happy to receive and evaluate your proposals. There are other interesting initiatives in the knowledge and innovation communities. They organize these climate master schools on climate change mitigation and adaptation. And here I heard in the previous talk a reference to a call for further focus on mitigation and adaptation. This is very true, in particular on adaptation. I work on both aspects, mitigation and adaptation, and I see a huge deficit in the awareness on the need to adapt. It's clear that some damages will occur, whatever the mitigation does, and we need to be prepared. You need to increase the resilience of Europe and its citizens to climate change, as some of it will happen. Of course, we need to mitigate as much as we can, but some damages will need to be dealt with. Also, another initiative from the EU is the EU Climate Pact that will be adopted on the 9th of December and published, which is meant at raising awareness on climate change and give a space for the debate, boost climate action at European level, and build on existing initiative in the EU. So I think the EU policies echo very much the recommendation from the ALLEA report that we heard of. I will not go through this. Many ideas are around. What we need to make sure is that these good contents, these good initiatives are deployed and reach a very high number of people of all ages. I insist on that. And that every company, every institution engages in a reflection on how it wishes to cope with climate change. I will give you an example. In the European Commission, in the Green Deal communication, there are just two lines on the fact that the European Commission as an administration is taking a commitment to be climate neutral by 2030. And this has triggered a debate within the Commission to actually improve the consistency of our approach, whereby, of course, we propose legislation, initiatives, policies for mitigation and adaptation, but we should also make an effort to change our practices at home, in Brussels and elsewhere, in all the sites where the Commission is established. And this is a very interesting experiment where you see the capacity of the staff, of the people to change and to apply to themselves the changes that they propose to others. I strongly recommend every academic institution, every school to start with, to try these experiments. We are learning so much, and that is one of the best form of education, in my view, on this issue, through the practice. And here, again, on the role of the scientific community, I don't want to repeat what has to be said. The scientific community has a huge role to play, but it's difficult, and we have to engage. The scientists need to engage with the citizens, also translate the IPCC reports, because yes, they are an authoritative reference, but they are quite difficult to understand. And I'm representing the European Commission in the IPCC meetings, and even the summary for policymakers are very difficult to communicate to policymakers. So we need to go further to explain, to improve the pedagogy around these reports. We have also, scientists have a very important role also in disseminating the science and fight against fake news and misconception. This can be a full-time job for a scientist, because the amount of information that is incorrect and not scientific is huge. And therefore, I would say it's a huge opportunity for scientists who are interested in this education part, but also a great responsibility, because it's a whole generation that needs to be educated, starting by those currently in power, and then going to those who will be in power in the future years. Thank you, and I hope I look forward to debating with you if we still have time.
Thank you, Dr. Tilkens. So now we'll move to a panel discussion. Hopefully we'll have some time to incorporate some of the questions that people are sharing via the chat forum. I'd just like to introduce two additional members to the panel discussion. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Agata Goszczyk, Head of the Science Communication and Education Unit in the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is a project coordinator at both Horizon 2020 and Erasmus Plus projects in Science Communication and Education Unit in the Institute of Geophysics, the Polish Academy of Sciences. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Michael John O'Mahony, Director of the Environmental Education Unit at Antashka, the National Trust for Ireland. This unit develops and delivers a wide range of national and international environmental management and education programs to a range of stakeholders, facilitating long-term sustainable actions for people's communities and their environments. So first of all, Dr. Goszczyk.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce the Polish perspective as regards climate change education. I found the findings of ALLEA report very universal and applicable to Polish situation in many ways. As concerns Poland, I would like to raise three main problems. First, in Poland, we do not have a systematic approach for the climate change education. We mainly observe many bottom-up activities. There are various educational resources available. However, they are mainly produced by various foundations, NGOs, or research institutions, which need to get external funding for such developments. These bodies do excellent job, and I must confess that the resources are of great quality. However, there is no common, easily accessible repository of such resources. They are also not properly grouped to cover different age groups. Moreover, similarly to ALLEA's findings, the resources are mainly dedicated to global perspective of climate change rather than focusing on local level. they also need to be expanded to focus more on mitigation and adaptation. We definitely need a common framework for climate change education in Poland, especially having in mind that Polish economy is currently based on carbon. And it's not unusual to hear official statements of politicians denying anthropogenic impact on climate change. Luckily, the need of change is seen also by young people, and since almost 2 years, we have been observing huge initiatives run by Eu Climate Strike. This is a Polish initiative under umbrella of international organization Fridays for Future. One of the postulates of this group is to introduce climate change topics in official curricula for all school stages. And before today's workshops, I have analyzed the curricula in terms of climate change issues. And my findings are not fortunate. Even though the general environmental education topics are introduced from primary to secondary schools on various subjects like geography, biology, chemistry, and techniques, the climate change appears only officially in secondary schools on geography. Last but not least is the problem of lack or very limited support for teachers. The average age of teachers in Poland is 44. It means they finished studies 20 years ago, when climate change issues were not publicized and the IPCC reports were hardly known. And as there is no obligatory training for in-service teachers in Poland, teachers are just not prepared well enough to introduce climate change issues in classroom. Quite often, they may feel uncomfortable if students know more about climate change than they know. So there is definitely a strong need of good quality and, more important, science-based trainings. I would like to conclude with a positive information, informing you that in June, the Ministry of Education in Poland introduced a new regulation that obliges teachers to discuss the most important climate and environmental protection issues with students, starting from this school year, so starting from September, during the weekly classes with the class teacher. How effective it will be, we will be able to assess within a few years from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goszczyk. And Dr. Michael John O'Mahony, Vantashka.
Good afternoon, everybody. I get the best bit, which is after everybody else speaking and taking all the good ideas, I'm now just going to make some comments. First of all, look, I really welcome this report. This is a requirement. This is a necessity. It's more than a requirement even. I suppose to start with, I think the follow-up research that was identified, I think will fill in a lot of the gaps that as of yet, I think we maybe need that little bit more information. And I think the glass is half full more than half empty than we maybe realize. I suppose going to the fundamental question and the title, Can Climate Change Education Save the Planet? I think maybe one of the ways we look at this is we kind of frame it from an ecosystem services viewpoint, whereby climate change education is an ecosystem service within the Healthy Planet setting. However, as was mentioned by many of the previous speakers, this ecosystem is coming under pressure from a whole range of reasons, from social media and from a whole range of political and social and economic environmental issues. And I would see that climate education has a very strong ability to rehabilitate. I, from my experience of this, can't overemphasize the importance of bringing the social sciences into this. I'm not a trained social scientist myself, but I've realized over the last 20 years how important social sciences are. Particularly we've found that there is a very important element to look at what we call the underlying cultural landscapes at a regional or national level. And as the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast all day. And I think that needs to be maybe considered. Other things that people have mentioned, I would completely reiterate: the importance of networks, critical, crucial. They're multi-level, they're practitioner-based and practitioner-focused. They are, in our experience, more than the sum of their parts. Also, a very important thing is participant focus when you're engaging with people. And a very big part of that is actually, as part of the communication and the education, is that listening for all of us is a really key important point. Going hand in hand with that is multi-level partnerships, whether it's at a governmental level, at an international level, regional level, really, really important. As was identified, role of teachers, absolute critical gatekeepers to the success of all this. Teacher training, absolutely critical as well from our experience. One of the things that comes out of this is from the teacher training is that the role of the teacher and the educator is very much along the lines of what's described as the sort of the humble leader. I think that's a very important element that differentiates climate change education from other education, and has to be very much authentic as well. Finally, I suppose, again, mentions of experiential learning in IBSE, absolutely would agree with that. Looking at the whole idea of program versus project as well, I think is quite important. We're also, like everybody, looking at the learnings from COVID-19 and the societal cohesion that's required in that space. And I suppose one of the things is just a very simple consideration that we have to kind of bring to this is that people have lives, and they're very, in inverted commas, in their reality, in their context, they're very busy. So this type of work, whether it's at a formal education level or more in the continuing education level, I think it's very important to have that insight and to give people that platform that we can work around. Scaling of these is going to be a huge challenge as well because of the urgency. And also, I think finally, there's actually a huge amount of information and insight that can be actually got from the participants. And I'll give you a very simple example. We've been working a whole range of environmental education programs, and at one of our conferences where a student was presenting, this 11-year-old student was talking about the North Pacific Gyre through a PowerPoint. And he actually got quite bored because he was just saying, here are all the different gyres around the world. And now they discovered that the North Pacific Gyre is actually 3 separate gyres. And he stopped and he said, maybe we should just go work out how we actually clean up the gyres instead of spending all our time actually just naming and classifying and actually moving to a practitioner-based outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mahoney. So I'd just like to invite Dr. Tulkins, Professor Lena and Dr. Cleena Murphy into the panel. We have a short amount of time to address, and there's been a huge number of really important questions that people have shared through the chat forum. And I suppose I was really struck by the sort of complex nature of climate change and climate change education, how the discussions are trying to grapple with that, and at the same time capturing the range of climate change education that is going on, which I think the earlier report goes a long way to sort of beginning that. And in particular, the urgency of finding a way forward. So there's maybe a couple of themes in relation to the questions. Maybe first, Dr. Murphy, just in relation to the themes of sort of interdisciplinarity and the importance of collaboration have come up a lot. And I just wondered, was there anything from the report that sort of spoke to those ideas? Sorry, Cleena, you're muted.
Okay, if only it was that easy. In terms of the multiple or multidisciplinary nature, absolutely. When you're looking at an effective professional development or education, climate change education initiatives, it's not just from the science perspective. It is absolutely vital that we take on board in terms of education, looking at socio-scientific. We need scientists, science educationals, social scientists, but you also need looking at different disciplines, looking at citizenship education as well. And I don't have the one answer of what this looks like. I think a lot of work needs to be done. And I think this is one of the things that appeals to me about the Green Deal call, that they're looking for this multidisciplinary competency framework. So I would say that, and from the recommendations of the report, that the different disciplines, multiple disciplines, have to feed in and be part of this NCF, the Multidisciplinary Competency Framework. And in terms of collaboration, 100%, I think you need to look at all different, universities, outreach centres, government, non-government policymakers. It is essential that there is collaboration, because if there's not buy-in from all different stakeholders, we're not going to have effective climate change education. I suppose that's opinion-based, but yeah.
Anyone else like to sort of pick up on that point? There was a couple of questions that sort of considered the impact of COVID-19 on climate change, and there was a question around whether anyone was either aware of any more recent science. I know that Professor Lennart talked about science in the making, about whether there was anything in relation to sort of the impact of COVID-19 on climate change. And I suppose alongside that, whether there are learnings from this time that we're in now that can be taken forward, maybe in relation to transport, infrastructure, children's lives. And it's open to anyone on the panel.
Are you asking me or Michael?
Professor Lennart, if you'd like to pick up, that would be great.
Oh, just one word. We have numbers. We begin to have numbers on the impact of the slowdown of the economy worldwide on CO2 production for the year 2020. Those numbers are around 7 or 8% decrease with respect to the rise. So it's still rising, but the inflection is significant. This is an example we can use for students in showing the global aspect in the reaction of the human system to a big and threatening change.
Thank you, Professor Lennart. Professor Tilkens, did you say?
Yeah, just very briefly, there are some EU projects who work on this issue. I was in a recent workshop where they proposed some recent results that they will prepare publications. And just to have in mind this Professor Friedlingstein in the UK. He's an expert in the carbon budget. And he raised also the issue of monitoring on an annual basis of the carbon budget. Is extremely challenging, of course. So the findings about COVID and the impact of COVID are subject to caution, because we don't have the sampling and the measures that allow to provide figures that are fully complete. But of course, it's a reduction of the emission, but we have to see the magnitude. But it shows that through change of behavior, in this case that was imposed, we can reduce the emission, but it will not suffice either. So we need technology improvement and implementation, change in behavior, and a real restructuring of the economy. The Green Deal approach, President von der Leyen says that this is the new growth model of the EU. And this is a very important affirmation that is quite disruptive if it is implemented as such. The concept of growth is not questioned as such, but the content of the growth, the economic growth, is indeed to be reformed through the Green Deal if we manage to implement it as we wish. Yes.
Dr. Mani.
I would totally agree with the previous speakers. Where I would look at this from is from the point of view of our learnings, that when we look at COVID, it's an immediate threat. It's there, and we're still seeing quite a bit of resistance to the science and to, as Professor Lena said, like the rational brain and the irrational part of society actually in quite a bit of conflict on this. And I think learnings from that will be very important when it comes to the impacts of climate and biodiversity loss. I think that there's huge potential there to learn quite a bit from that. And a colleague recently mentioned to me that in many cases, when it comes to the sort of the resistance to science, public health, and all these things, you almost need to take almost like a cult deprogramming approach to people on that, and that's quite an insight that we have to maybe go to that level. And as climate is generally in the public's view is more immediate, or young people are very conscious of its immediate impact, but particularly as we move up the generations, it's not as immediate. And I suppose learning from the inverse of that is the issue with COVID, where COVID is a much more immediate threat to our older population.
Oh, you're muted.
Dr. Gojic or Dr. Murphy, anything to add in that regard?
No, thank you.
Just on very, very quickly, I would totally agree with you there, particularly in terms of pedagogy for teachers. And there's a lot of research done on nature of science pedagogy, which affords teachers and children to contemplate on the nature of science, looking at the type of work scientists do, the type of information they provide. And there's a lot of education research literature out there showing the effectiveness of nature science pedagogy in providing children and young people with the requisite knowledge and skills to make sense of science in the news, to make sense of science in the making. So I think, and in terms of multidisciplinary framework, I think nature science pedagogy would be essential and would have a huge role in to prepare our young people, you know, as it would add to their scientific literacy, and that they would have the knowledge and skills to make sense of science in the news.
Dr. Tokens?
Yeah, I would have a provocative request. Now the students are following the classes online at university, also some in high school in some European countries, but I've seen very few universities proposing their classes online open to all. They keep that for the students registered in the university. Can't we really make a difference here and invite these top universities with the best professors to open, and that would actually have a major impact on the transfer of knowledge, because for the teachers at different levels, sometimes they are not as good as the professors in Oxford, Cambridge, or University of Dublin, and they would be happy to see more courses taught in university shared with all. And they could show that to their students, and that would have a multiplying effect that would be huge. But of course, there are some issues of property rights, but that should be addressed, because in the report that is published, I see that the recommendations are very relevant, but they are very mild also. They don't explicitly suggest to change the programs, education program in high school. They don't propose to really share and have open source courses from top universities to help the teachers in secondary schools and so on, while this could make a big difference. But we need to, if we want to accelerate the transfer of knowledge, the implementation of the transition, we need also to accelerate the way we teach all generation to make sure that we don't miss the train.
Thank you. And we have maybe a sort of final question, which was mentioned by a couple of people, and it was in relation to the sort of challenges of addressing climate change as difficult knowledge, questions around eco-anxiety, and questions around the sort of importance of hope and sort of action orientation and solution-oriented education. I suppose it would maybe be nice if people had any thoughts on the role of those approaches within education.
Can I start, Benjamin?
Yeah, of course.
On that, what we're seeing is we're starting to see, I suppose, generational jump from primary to secondary to third level in some of the programs we deliver. So that's that's one thing that we won't call it intelligence, but the hope is being transferred, and it's quite sticky as it's going up the line. This is also impacting in the wider community, and also in our more kind of commercial and corporate operations. I suppose one of the things though would be that we have found on that is that the best hope is actually action. That people being empowered makes a huge difference. It's creating the format and the framework and the platform for that is really important at all levels, at all scales. We've seen some pretty quiet but drastic, in a very good sense, transformations of quite hardcore minds as regards that this is the way things should be, and quite indoctrinated to moving to a more, as I said, stand back, delegate appropriately, don't have it in a sort of a very transactional scenario that is more of a relational scenario, which I think one of the key things here is leadership. And I suppose the good thing that we're seeing is that particularly among young people and younger people, and also among teachers, that there is great leadership out there, and it's just to support that is hugely important, because it just gives huge dividend back.
Would anyone else like to jump in to finish this off?
Not to finish it off, but I would just absolutely 100% agree with Dr. O'Mahony there, that and that me working with students and with teachers and different school projects or whatever they might have engaged in, it's the young people are well able to make sense and deal with the issues around climate change, but when you give them action or get them to consider solutions and that they can actually do something about it, it does take this fear away, and they are more positive. So I would think action-based and looking at adaptation and mitigation and action-based solutions is the way to go, that children are empowered and feel a sense of agency in addressing some of these issues.
If I may add something, I think what we observed in Poland during demonstrations of Eu Climate Strike, I believe we have quite many leaders on board, young leaders on board. So, and also quite many girls among them. So I believe we have this leadership already, and we just need to give them power. And also my question is how to change the top-down approach. So especially in Poland, it's really difficult. Maybe that's why we have so many demonstrations and so many actions bottom-up inspired. So of course, it would be great to have a common framework for climate change introduction into curricula. However, how to convince governments to apply equally these ideas in various countries. Thank you.
Could I say a word just there?
Well, yes, thank you.
About government. Dr. Tulkens, you made a beautiful talk on the EU strategy, and I hope what you have outlined will happen in the next years. You also mentioned subsidiarity, which is the rule, of course, and climate cannot be dealt by single countries alone. And Europe has understood this, I think, with the Green Deal already. We have to foster the global vision in the young people. And education systems are there to do that. And we have to do it together. We cannot do it pieces by pieces because one minister likes it and the other does not. So we have to convince ministers that for the future of the planet, for the future of Europe, they have to accept to work together and to work with you in the frame you just outlined. I repeat what I said before. The ROCA report had exactly the same objection, and still the ministers agreed through some I would say, common silent agreement that EU could spend money on that, because science was so vital for the future of Europe. So I cannot believe that we'll say education stops at my border because I am the master of education in my country, period, for climate. This is not acceptable for the future of Europe. Sorry to be so strong, but I think we have to say that.
I think that's a really good place to bring things to a conclusion. I would like to bring the webinar to a close. Firstly, I'd like to thank each of the participants for what was a hugely informative session, covering a huge area, a complex area, and really shining important lights onto some of the sort of key essential things that we need to achieve moving forward. Secondly, I would like to thank both the Royal Irish Academy and ALLEA for co-hosting the event and bringing together such a great panel. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for finding the time to join us here this evening and for so many of the important questions, ideas, thoughts, and actions that you shared. So have a nice evening and goodbye.